Before we go too in-depth in anatomy, which we'll do in the next chapters, we just need to have a quick discussion about anatomical names. Learning the anatomical names is probably one of the most overwhelming and confusing parts of learning anatomy. And if you focus way too much on the names, this will take focus from learning more important things like the shapes. It's really easy to focus more on the basic part, which is just memorize the specific names of specific muscles, but the important part is really just understanding the main volumes of the muscles. In terms of using anatomical names in this course, we're going to be using a bit of mix of everything. I'm going to keep it as simple as I reasonably can, as well as explaining or mentioning the actual anatomical term for things. For instance, if we're dealing with the collarbones here, I might be calling them the clavicles as well. So I might say collarbones or clavicles. Just means the same thing, just so that you can get used to the actual names. Shoulder blades, might say scapula for the shoulder blades, just because it's more specific. Personally, my opinion is that the anatomical names are really overcomplicated, and a lot of times it's almost like people are trying to show off with the anatomical names. So we're going to keep them simple, easy to understand, while at the same time getting you a bit primed for the actual anatomical names, because it is important to know those as well, because otherwise you won't really be able to have conversations with other people, and it's hard to Google things, and all anatomical models are going to be using the existing terminology. As a heads up, there isn't really a unified system for anatomical terms, as some come from Latin, some come from Greek, some refer to the shape of the muscle, some of the origin and insertion point, some of their size. So it's really a huge mess. And while there is, of course, some logic to it, which we'll get to in a sec, a lot of it is just down to memorization. But hopefully just by going through this course, a lot of this stuff will get easier. Here are some explanations for some of the terms. These are terms you're all going to be hearing throughout the course in terms of like muscle names or like bony landmarks and such like that. So the first one is going to be medial. Medial means towards the midline. So if you have like a medial bone or something, then it's going to be towards the midline. If you have a lateral bone or lateral anything, that means away from the midline. This is like pretty specific. So it means, for instance, with you have down here, we'll actually talk specifically about these ones. These are called epicondyles, just means, again, pointy bits. And this is the medial epicondyle, and this is the lateral epicondyle. It just means medial towards the center, lateral away from the center. So it's not like if you were to rotate this, if you were to like rotate, you can't really do that, but let's say you could rotate this bone around so they will face it the other way. This would still be the medial point, and this would still be the lateral point, because the points are fixed to their original things. Like they're not going to switch around like that. Then we have anterior. Anterior means towards the front, and at the same time we have posterior. We have towards the back. So anterior, front, posterior, back. This is one of the things like people are making really funny jokes about it. They're like, your posterior is nice, and they're going to be like, your butt is nice because it's on the back. So they might be talking about posterior and they're talking about a butt. So posterior towards the back, anterior towards the front. So you have, like, for instance, a point here called anterior. It's a bit of a mouthful. Anterior superior iliac spine, and you have the opposite here just with posterior in the name. So there are terms like that. Usually when you're adding a posterior or a like an anterior or a posterior, that refers to something else. You're not just gonna go, like, you're not just gonna be adding this to something. You're not just gonna be doing like the anterior pectoralis, because there is no posterior pectoralis. You're usually doing it to differentiate this specific shape from something else, because you might have two of them. So if there's just one, you're not just gonna add fancy stuff to it. It is to be specific about it. Then we have superior. Superior is probably one of those you're gonna just intuitively know, because it's actually like an English word, being superior to something. Superior means above. And then at the same time, you have inferior, also a perfectly normal English word, which means below. So superior, above, and then you have inferior, below. So here, for instance, you have a muscle here called the supraspinatus. Supra, just superior, and this is just spinatus, the spine. Just this one here, the spine of the scapula. And then at the same time, you also have the infraspinatus going here, and this is infra, just same as infrared or inferior. And this just goes below the spine. So if you have an infra, you're going to have a supra. If you have a anterior, you're going to have a posterior. So this is just a way to demystify some of the terms. We have a major and a minor, which should be obvious what those mean. A major is bigger and minor is smaller. For instance, here we have the pectoralis major going like here. And then we have the pectoralis minor going here. Pick a different color, going underneath here. And just keeps it nice and simple. So if there is a pectoralis minor, you can be sure there is a pectoralis major. In this case, you can actually see there is some logic to it. So it's not just like you just have to memorize an insane amount of like specific knowledge. There is some kind of system to a lot of the different terms. Another one of these is going to be longus. That just means long. Then you have brevis. That means short. So you're probably going to have a muscle. We're definitely going to have muscles in, for instance, the arm. One is going to be longus. One is going to be brevis. And they're going to have a lot of different things in them as well. But just longus, the long muscle. Brevis would be the short muscle. So longus just means long and brevis just means short, like the English word for brevity. So brevity just means, if you're not familiar with that word, just means shorter. Then I want to cover some specific terms that may seem very complicated. One is called a coracobrachialis, which is one hell of a mouthful. Coracobrachialis sounds like the most insane thing. It sounds like a dinosaur. But if you start to break it down, coraco is this guy here, the coraco process. And then brachialis just means brachy. That's just the English word or Latin word for arm. So the coracobrachialis just goes from the coraco process to the brachy, to the arm. Then we have another insane mouthful as well called the sternocleidomastoid. And that just sounds like the most bonkers muscle in the world, sternocleidomastoid, sternocleidomastoid. But if you break it down, sterno is this shape here. This is a sternum. This is just this whole shape. Cleido is this shape here. Clavicle. And mastoid is this guy up here, which is the mastoid process. Process is also not a word for, you guessed it, pointibit. So this is just a pointibit. If you just were to think about the dots we talked about before, one dot is sterno, one is cleido, and the other one is mastoid. So sterno, cleido, mastoid. Now we have this muscle here. So some of this stuff makes sense. This is not the case with all muscles, not at all. Some of this is just complicated. It's not like you can just learn like an underlying system and now you know everything, but it does help. It does help to know that pectoralis major is the breast muscle, but it's the larger breast muscle. If you have the bicep brachii, just a fancy word for the muscle we have here, the bicep, that means bi is just two, and then you have two heads. So this is just going to have two heads going up to it. So it just means it's going to be separated out into two heads. And bicep is, just that, two heads. And brachii just means the arm. So if there is a brachii, it's probably a non-brachii as well, right? There's probably a bicep somewhere else. In this case, it's going to be in the thigh. So you have, for instance, a bicep femoris, which is going to be down here as well. So that's essentially the naming for now. We will go through the fancy naming as we get to the fancy muscles, but I'm going to try to keep it simple. Anatomy is hard enough as it is. There's no point in just introducing an insane amount of anatomical terms just for the hell of it. We're not trying to sound smart when learning anatomy. That's not the goal. If you want to do that, do the sciences or whatever. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create convincing characters that look credible. The way I like to think about anatomical terms as well is, let's say you live in your hometown. You know the city in and out. You know where every single shop is, all the cool little secrets, all the sideways, all that. You can navigate it just by the cobblestones under your boots. But you may not actually know any of the names. You just know the city. You know the layout of it. That's how I am with my hometown in Bergen in Norway. I know the city. I have no idea what any of the names mean. So if somebody tells me, hey, we should meet at this spot, I have no idea where that is. But if they show me a picture of it, of course I can navigate to that. And it's the same thing with anatomical names as well. You can have somebody who understands the shapes of the muscles very, very well. and they can sculpt anything they want to. Like, they understand all the muscles and all that. They just don't happen to know the naming of it. And you can have somebody who has the exact opposite experience. In this case, they might know every single street name of my hometown in Bergen, but they've never been there. They don't actually know the city. They don't know the little secrets. They don't know the feeling of being in the city, but they technically know all the names. Same thing here. You might have doctors or people studying just the names who know every single name of all the things. It does not mean they're good at sculpting or good at creating art whatsoever. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind, that it is of course useful to know the names, because it means that you'll be specific about things. If you're working at a studio and somebody's like the costal cartilage needs a bit more work, or it's not correct, you're like, cool, I know it's this region here. You can work with this. But you still know what you're talking about. Even if you didn't know the names, they could still be like, hey, the costal cartilage. And you'd be like, what? And you'd be like, this region here. Cool, of course I got it. Then you'll still be fine. All I'm trying to say is it's really important to focus on understanding the anatomy and not just focusing on the names. That's a very, very common mistake to do. But for the remaining of this course, we are going to be using anatomical names where they make sense. We're not going to avoid them for the sake of avoiding them, because there's still a lot of merit to learning them, but we're also not just going to be too specific. I'm not going to go at the interior notch of the superior crevice. There you find the plane change. I'm going to go like, no, look at the thing here, and just be like pointing at it, right? Just keeping this stuff simple.